This is the American Law Journal.
Last year, Yahoo CEO said no more telecommuting for their employees. Best Buy Corporation followed suit. Has telecommuting become a trend in reverse, or has the train already left the station? Good evening, I'm Christopher Naughton. Welcome to ALJ. 3 million people telecommute to their jobs every week, but some large corporations are bucking that trend. Does the boss ever have to offer you flex time and telecommuting privileges? Here's a report from CBS Sunday Morning.
Thanks for calling JetBlue. This is Michelle. How can I help you?
Each day, Michelle Muir puts on her JetBlue t-shirt and her JetBlue airplane slippers. She handles reservations from 7 to 5 with a couple of breaks.
The TrueBlue department will go ahead and register him, okay?
What the airline calls its customer support team. More than 1,900 employees work from home in and around Salt Lake City. The arrangement saves the company a lot of money on office space.
Did he sleep good last night?
For Michelle Muir, a devout Mormon, it means she can be the homemaker,
Go see Grandpa.
wife, and grandmother she wants to be. But how does JetBlue know Michelle Muir is actually working?
She's been logged in for 2 minutes.
Okay, let's see how many points it takes.
All her calls are recorded, and her supervisor can see and hear exactly what she's doing. Rebecca Ludlow works from JetBlue's customer support center a few miles away, except when she too telecommutes 1 day a week.
All right, I love the pleases. I heard a little too many okays though.
Ludlow regularly critiques Muir's calls.
And the first column here is be in blue always. I'm going to say you did a great job in being in blue. You represent JetBlue very well.
So you've got JetBlue, known for its customer service, on lists of good companies to work for, committed to telecommuting. Then there's Zappos.com, the Las Vegas-based online shoe and accessory retailer, also known for customer service and on lists of the best employers. It discourages telecommuting.
Our number one priority is company culture, and our whole belief is that if we get the culture right, then most of the other stuff will be a natural byproduct of that.
Tony Shea is CEO of Zappos.com.
So we encourage our employees to actually interact as much as possible, both inside and outside of the office. And that's hard to do from a telecommuting position.
But sociologist Jennifer Glass thinks telecommuting is the future, especially considering research done on the millennial generation.
They've grown up with technology, they're used to using it, and they expect to use it in their jobs. They place a very high value on autonomy, and they want the ability to telecommute.
All right, 3 guests weigh in tonight. Let's go ahead and meet them. Anthony Haller hails from Blank Rome, Corporate Defense Counsel, heading up their labor and employment group. Chambers USA says that Mr. Haller would be at the top of anyone's best litigators list. Robin Bond is an authority on employment law and human resources. She's founder of her own firm, Transition Strategies, right outside of Philadelphia, former in-house counsel for Hahnemann University Hospitals, and author of this book, How to Negotiate a Killer Job Offer. And Mark Rappaport hails from New York City with Rappaport Law, representing employees in age, race, sex, discrimination, retaliation matters, and including telecommuting and flex time issues that come up. And he says they come up a little bit more often in litigation than you might think. All right, everything seemed to be moving in a great direction regarding telecommuting. Inexorably moving down the track, everyone seemed to embrace it. And then last year, Marissa Mayer, there she is, CEO with Yahoo, steps into the glare of the media and says, we're done. So Anthony, what do you think has happened here? Not just with Marissa Mayer, but with a lot of other corporations that followed suit.
Well, I think the other major corporation that did it was Best Buy. And I think that at least the explanations given by both companies was that they felt that they needed more collaboration, that there wasn't enough energy that was developed as in between people by speaking remotely. And therefore, particularly for Yahoo, which is in a very competitive space, particularly, very near Google, and probably losing ground to Google, they really needed something, Marissa Mayer felt, to jumpstart the way they collaborated on projects and developed
So they were
their
losing
technology.
some juice. There was an absence of that kind of corps d'esprit that we might see when people are in the same space. That's a fair argument, isn't it, Mark?
I don't think it is, Chris. And in fact, I think what you said earlier, has the train left the station? I think it left the station at least 2 to 3 years ago. And this is something that particularly once you give employees this opportunity, or even some employees this opportunity, you can see the reaction to what happened. It's not positive. That's been my experience in dealing with employees. And from a perspective of litigation, judges and juries are going to relate to telecommuting. This is not abnormal at this point. This is the norm.
And what was right for Yahoo is not necessarily going to be right for everybody else. But in this day and age, I mean, who isn't telecommuting? Telecommuting is just extending the work hours, and it's a trade-off basically between, you know, the productivity that you can get from working at home versus the connectivity of being, you know, plugged in with all your collaborators at work. Everybody works at home will tell you, boy, there's no interruptions. I'm trading the chaos of the office.
Yeah, but is the jury still out yet when it comes to productivity? I don't think there's anything dispositive out there. You know, 60% of the people said they were more productive at home, but that seems rather subjective.
Well, I just think that what people may not realize, and is a subtext to what Yahoo and Best Buy have done, is that there are all kinds of hidden problems with people working at home. And it's still very much a minority of the working population. It's something like 2.9%, if that.
I'll give you some statistics here in a minute.
It's certainly growing, but it's not everybody.
Of course.
And there are a number of very tricky legal issues that we can discuss that arise from it. And that on top of the fact that many people think collaboration in the workplace is better when you're looking face to face. I think many of us feel that way about devices, that with family and friends you lose that human touch, and that creates something that's missing in life, and in this case it's in work life.
Let me jump in for a second. I think that what's missing is what's obvious, I think, in the workforce, is that at some level the majority of people in certain professions are working from home at least part of the time. This has become part of how work is done today. So to characterize this as a small minority, I don't think is quite accurate. This is something
well, actually,
that
here are
we
the
all
statistics, and then we'll get to you, Robin. Right now, about 14 million U.S. workers do their jobs at home at least one day a week. That's not, Anthony may be right. It's a smaller percentage if they're telecommuting full time. That's about 10% of the workforce, although those numbers show an almost 20% increase over 5 years. So again, if the train hasn't left the station, it's certainly moving in that direction. Robin, you were saying?
Right. I was just saying that I think that number is very small that Anthony quoted. Like the statistics I've seen are more like 30% of the workforce is doing some sort of telecommuting, and this might be just a couple days of working from home, or extending the work day by working part of the time from home, or flex hours, working part of the time from home. I mean, telecommuting can be whatever is working for that company or for that employee, so it's flexible.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I think of telecommuting as an arrangement with an employer where you have an understanding that you can work from home a day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, as opposed to people doing things outside of the typical workplace, the office or the factory. But typically, you know, when we're talking about these kind of issues, it's people that are working not in sort of blue-collar jobs, but in service kind of industries. And people are working on airplanes, they're working in airports, they're working on a train, they're working sometimes texting in a car, actually, which is a liability for employers,
well, of course,
by the way.
It is, although they're getting more hours that way out of their employees. That's another issue. But Marissa Meyer for Yahoo and Best Buy, they weren't saying, well, people can work at home 1 or 2 or 3 days a week. Basically, I think if I understood them, Anthony, we want them here 95, 100% of the time. And it seems like there's some equivocation here between, you know, the person who telecommutes 5 days a week is at home 5 days a week, monitored from afar from their supervisor, versus someone who spends a day or two.
And they weren't saying at night you can't go into your computer and link in and talk to your manager or talk to another employee and do some work on a project. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about as a regular concept in the work week. We want you at work in the building, working alongside other people, collaborating, creating, and doing something that we believe requires that human interaction.
And that sounds eminently reasonable to me, but it's interesting when the Yahoo and Best Buy attorneys were questioned by the media as to, what about the efficacy? Is this a good move on the part of your corporations? They almost sounded defensive. They said, well, there's no inherent right to telecommute. Well, when did that become an issue? I mean, when would someone have said, it's my God-given right, it's my legal right that I telecommute?
Go ahead.
I think there'd be two situations in which that would come about. Number one is as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And number two, when an employer has already opened up that door to some employees, how does it then justify denying it to other employees who have similar or identical responsibilities? That's where I have seen litigation.
Right. And those are the strongest points for plaintiffs, correct?
Absolutely.
I mean, because let's face it, if the employer closes the door or never opened it, they've got a tough argument to beat.
That's going to be a more challenging situation. Although
it's not airtight. I know from your position you don't feel it's airtight.
I'm going to make that argument.
Right.
But if they've opened the door, I'm going to come in there, and if my client is either denied that right or quite often has had it and then taken away, and that's really a catalyst for litigation.
Well, does everyone want to see why management gets so upset with telecommuting? In this very short clip with very few words, and you might even find Anthony Haller's name here in the credits, let's take a look, and I think, again, without any words, you'll see why telecommuting makes management crazy.
I wanted to see how things were working out with Tammy working from home. Dudley Smith came to me yesterday and he said that he needed to work from home because of treatment. And before I said yes, I just wanted to be sure that we feel as if we can manage this well.
Funny you should ask, Roland. I've just tried reaching Tammy and I can't seem to get a hold of her. I wonder if she's okay.
Well, you certainly threw in the kitchen sink there, Anthony. Anything that could go wrong did go wrong, although I especially enjoyed the part of the gal dancing to aerobics with the half gallon of ice cream. That was a nice touch. That was really, you like that, Robin, huh?
I did. I have 3 words for that company: keystroke monitoring technology. Okay. I mean, if you're going to have people working at home, first of all, you ought to take precautions, and if you have a policy that says how you're going to do it, and secondly, an agreement that sets forth the terms for working at home to cover all these conditions that Anthony has in his videotape about, workers' comp issues, protection of confidential information issues, hours of work. I mean, the whole panoply of things. And then when people abuse the situation like this, you have the right to say, hey, you've broken the contract, you've broken the agreement, and we're taking this away from you because of your own misconduct.
So going back to what the Yahoo and Best Buy attorneys, who were so defensive and said this is not an inherent right, they wouldn't have said that unless they felt that some courts are looking at this as a quote-unquote right. You talked about disabilities and you talked about opening the door. Give me an example in litigation where one of your clients said, this is my right.
My biggest case last year was on behalf of 2 women worked for a major financial company. There was a takeover. The right to telecommute was taken away. We argued that it was discriminatory. We were able to pinpoint people across the country that did similar tasks who still had the right to telecommute, and we settled it favorably. That, I would say, is a very, to say that there is no right is a fallacy, because the truth is that most companies do allow employees to telecommute. It's interesting, I think Anthony's video actually underscores what we were arguing in the case, which is that my clients were being perceived in a stereotypical way because they were young women, mothers, and that's why they were given this opportunity. Their performance reviews were actually excellent. So the employer, to argue in that situation that somehow their performance wasn't up to par, simply didn't comport with what the evidence showed.
Studies show, Chris, that the average telecommuter is actually a male. So this isn't really a woman's issue. Like 3 out of 4 telecommuters are men. And most telecommuters are Gen Y, the age of 18 to 35. So I do think that is a serious factor. But when a company is deciding whether or not to allow telecommuting, what they need to be looking at is not the age, race, gender thing. They need to determine it based on the job, because that's how you decide whether a job itself is appropriate. And then you have to allow all people within the jobs to have the same rights to telecommute. And I think that's the important thing where maybe some companies are falling down, is if the job is appropriate for telecommuting, fine. Not all jobs are appropriate for telecommuting.
Yeah, if you're a waiter, if you've got to work as a stewardess, we understand that. There's certainly no right to that, and it's just not going to happen. But once again, go ahead.
But I think here is the issue that we've really got to focus on. If you have a policy as an employer that we want everybody to come to work and that is your policy, then you don't open the door on telecommuting. Now that's very difficult to do these days, I recognize that, but that's what Yahoo and Best Buy have done, and therefore you remove most of the issues we're talking about.
Yes.
I agree.
It's an all or nothing.
One of the few areas I'm going to agree with Mark is that if you open the door, then now you have an issue, which is how are you administering that policy? Who's being permitted to do it? Are you doing it in a non-discriminatory way? Right. And if somebody is sick or have a disability, should they be entitled to work from home? And the disability area is where this issue comes up the most. And it's interesting that the courts have evolved in their thinking over time. There's a line of cases from the Seventh Circuit that started with the proposition it would be a rare occurrence, if ever, if it be appropriate for an individual to work from home. And yet there was a recent case out of that circuit which has said, well, that's really a decision that was made 15 years ago, and things have changed radically since then. So I think you do see the courts becoming more receptive to the argument that if you allow people to work from home, and then if somebody has a disability, that you have to have a fact-based analysis as to whether or not you really need that person at work. But I do want to say this, even the EOC's guidance focuses on not on whether it's a reasonable accommodation. This is where many people mistake this issue. Right. Is it an essential function of the job? If it's an essential function of the job, it's never a reasonable accommodation. Right. And that's sort of where you have to focus.
Part of the argument here has been that from claimants or employees' standpoint is that, yes, working at home I can be more productive. But then the other side of that coin is, when am I on the job? When am I off the job? Am I actually working more than the 40 or 50 hours or what have you that my employer demands of me? Do I always feel like I'm on the job? Not good for an employee, maybe not good for an employer either, because now what's the scope of employment? When are you furthering, the boss's best interest? So a lot of blurred lines here. Not good for the employee and maybe not good for the employer either. You're always on the job. Let's take that one first. You're never off the job.
Absolutely. From the employee's perspective, that is something that I have explored in cases, and we will look at text messages and emails and show that an employee is in fact working overtime, not being compensated. A lot of times those are going to be exempt employees. That's the reality, the people that are going to do that managerial. Right. Okay. But so that's going to be the norm, but in those situations where they're not exempt, and I will pull together the text messages. I had a case last year which a woman was working as an assistant to a very wealthy family, and she was literally on the job all the time. We were showing text messages on Saturday morning, Sundays, all hours of the night, and we put that together. We added an overtime claim. We did it under New York City law, and it was effective.
That's a good example of where the difficulties lie, and the traps for the employers. So for starters, I would always recommend to my clients that they not allow telecommuting for people who are non-exempt, where you have to track hours because of the difficulties associated with that. By way of example, if the woman in our little vignette was non-exempt, then how would you count the hours? And maybe it's when she logs onto the computer and when she logs off, but what's she doing in between, and how do you monitor those things?
Right, and then you have Fair Labor Standard issues and a headache upon a headache.
Exactly.
I would view that as the burden of management, and that is something that can exist even when people are not telecommuting. In fact, the case that I was just talking about was somebody who was really working at the job site during the day, just that she was never really off the job because the employer was constantly reaching out to her, making demands.
What I want to make clear about that vignette, though, is a lot of the things that are going on there are things that actually happen in the workplace. Sure. Making coffee, people do that all the time, going and getting your lunch. Right. People go and work out, if there's a gym. So it's not necessarily bad that that's happening. It's just a question of how do you manage it, how do you monitor it, how do you assess it. And Mark's right, the burden's on the employer, and therefore, do you want to accept that kind of burden?
Because I would think also if someone gets hurt, again, in that vignette, she trips over, now again, she's furthering the boss's interest because, she trips over her own dumbbell.
That's not an academic. There are two cases that I really like. There's a case from Florida, Sandburg, which was somebody who was working with fabric, and she tripped over some fabric, broke her leg, and she brought in a workers' comp claim, and she got a claim. There's a Pennsylvania case, chief of police of a city who was at home cleaning his gun and accidentally shot himself. And they said that was part of
performing his
duties, and therefore he's entitled to workers' comp.
Right.
And then there are other hidden issues that people don't think about, which is, for instance, where do you pay taxes? Are you subjecting yourself to the taxes of another state? Is the employer subjecting itself to taxes of another state?
And not only taxes, but now maybe if it gets into a litigious situation, you're outside the jurisdiction you want to be in.
Exactly. And what about safety? Safety and health. I mean, OSHA doesn't inspect people's homes when they're working from home, but it is covered by the general duty provision, so they could inspect if somebody reports a problem. If you put equipment in the home, then you have a duty as an employer to make sure that that's safely installed and maintained in a safe way. So there are a lot of very tricky and hidden issues. And I think that creates the factual issues Mark was talking about, which is a bonanza for plaintiffs' lawyers.
These are opportunities. Look, I think the biggest indication that this train left the station is that federal agencies are now evaluated in part on how much they accommodate telecommuting. This is actually a positive thing across the board. HR people in the federal government are actually evaluated positively by promoting this.
Since the train has been moving down the track, and again, most corporations, if they haven't, will probably consider telecommuting in the present and the future. Here's some bits of advice to minimize telecommuting related risk exposure. One, ensure telecommuters have workers' comp coverage. Secondly, verify that company's general liability policy applies to the active telecommuters. Check that home workspace does not violate the telecommuter's homeowner's insurance policy. Offer training and guidelines for efficient teleworking, and provide workers with the right equipment and support. It all sounds reasonable, Robin, does it not?
Yes, it really does. The other thing too, I was interested about the daycare. I would also put in my agreement that telecommuting and working from home is not a substitute for daycare. And that if you're going to work from home, you also have to have daycare provisions. And when we're talking about these retaliation claims, a great way to defend against these is to make sure that you are truly monitoring the productivity of the employees. And when I said to you, sort of, my funny reaction to Anthony's video was keystroke monitoring. Well, that's, it's a very legitimate thing that you can do. But also really be objective and measurable in the output that your employees are giving you. If they're giving you the goals and meeting the objectives, then you don't arbitrarily or capriciously say, oh, you're not meeting performance standards. That's when you have people who complain and say, wow, my boss isn't being fair to me. They're retaliating against me and taking away this benefit.
But to me, that sounds so Orwellian, to have keystroke monitoring. You don't do that at work when people are in their offices. If they're sitting in an office.
They could, though. They have access to the computer.
They absolutely can.
No, I know you can.
They had to.
I know you can, but people
and a manager probably surreptitiously is looking over his shoulder, or the worker's looking over his or her shoulder because the manager is looking over his. So it's not the kind of Orwellian monitoring that you might get, as we saw in that JetBlue package or the JetBlue situation in our feature report at the very top of the program. But what is the alternative at that point?
Well, no, that's the trouble. I mean,
that is
you
the trouble.
do have to monitor productivity.
Right. We're not putting cameras in the houses yet.
And in this respect, it's really not so different from what happens in a regular employment scenario where the person is in the office, meaning having objective, regular performance evaluations. As an attorney for employees, what constantly amazes me is how many employers, even the largest employers with sophisticated HR staff, don't evaluate or don't evaluate objectively. And in this sense, it's really no different. You're going to have to come up with new ways, but it really comes down to evaluating performance.
I want to thank my three guests tonight. Anthony Howler, Corporate Defense Counsel with Blank Rome, heading up their labor and employment group. Robin Bond, joining us for the very first time tonight, founder of her own firm, Transition Strategies, and author of this book, How to Negotiate a Killer Job Offer. Mark Rappaport with Rappaport Law in Manhattan, New York City, representing the employees. For all of us here at the American Law Journal, thanks for joining us this week. Until next week, case closed.
This week's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Blank Rome, providing strategic advice for employers in today's workplace. Scheller PC, protecting consumer rights since 1977. And The Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal newspaper for lawyers.